may seem a bit facetious, but one of the most influential books of the last 30 years was produced by a man from Lahore, Mahbub al-Haq, working together with Amartya Sen. And if you look at the cover of the third Human Development Report from 1992, it's a glass that looks a little bit like this, but is more elongated, more like you might have an oyster or champagne in. And what does the glass represent? The glass represents actually income distribution in the world. So the bottom of the glass sort of represents the share of the 20% of the people in the world. Very, very small. The top of the glass, which is 150 times larger than the bottom of the glass, represented the share of the top 20% in the world. Now that was in 1992. Today it's probably a bit different. In fact, the latest statistic I had, the world's richest 1%, those with more than $1 million, own 45% of the world's wealth. So in the Human Development Reports, going back to 90 and 92, one of the key facets is that economic growth does not automatically improve people's lives, either within nations, such as within Pakistan, or among nations internationally. In fact, if you look at the, and we discussed this actually in the populism session yesterday, and I think there's a couple of people who were there, about equity and development, that the two countries in the world which have made the most progress in the last 100 years in human development are the two which have had the most equitable income distribution. And those are, if you can't guess, it's Sweden and Japan. Now, we are fortunate to have a wonderful panel here. I had prepared very good introductions, but they've now been introduced by the MC. But to have Dr. Amjad Saqib, who is the leader of the world's largest interest-free microfinance program. It's a privilege to be on the same panel with him. To have Taimur Jangra, who is an engineer, had worked for McKinsey's, but is better known now as the Minister of Finance of the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and a strong partner of the United Nations. We're fortunate to have Hafiz, who will be talking next, who has been chairman of the Planning Commission. He's been Minister of Finance, and he also was my boss at one point for about a year and a half when he was director of UNDP's Regional Bureau for Asia Pacific and Assistant Secretary General, the first Pakistani to have had that job and the only to have had that job. And then on our left, Erum Khalid Sattar, who's a professor at Tufts and Northeastern University. She has a doctorate from Harvard, and on her dissertation committee was one of the co-founders of the Human Development Report, Dr. Amartya Sen. So we have about an hour. I should say that we're hoping that Dr. Shima Kermani will join the panel during the course of the discussion, and I think you know her as Pakistan's leading exponent of Bharatayanam Jatiya. Okay, I'm not pronouncing it right. And also, but more reason we had her on this panel is she's the founder of Tehreek-e-Niswan, which is one of the first women's movements dealing with the tremendous exclusion that so many women face. So why did we think this was an important topic? Very briefly, Agenda 2030, also known as Sustainable Development Goals, is about leaving no one behind. It's about reaching the furthest behind first. If you look at SDG 10, which is about reducing inequality, that's never been in a global goal before. The first target is progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. Pakistan has committed to do that over the next, well, now 13 years or so. In Pakistan, quoting Mahbub al-Haq again, the problem of 22 families controlling 66% of Pakistan's industrial assets remains still relevant today, and there is rising inequality in Pakistan on all measures, whether it's income or what's called multidimensional poverty. But with that, I think I might pass on to Hafiz, who is the leader of a team that UNDP has put together on the National Human Development Report for Pakistan, whose theme is human development and inequality. And he'll give an update of where that work is and frame the discussion, and the other panelists will comment on different topics.
Members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, as always, coming to the literary festival is a source of great joy and hope that we still have those traditions in our country. Let me start by just very quickly quoting from the latest World Inequality Report of 2018. It has a very appropriate sentence. If rising inequality or diminishing equity is not properly monitored and addressed, it can lead to various sorts of political, economic, and social catastrophes. The word catastrophes has been used. And clearly, this will reduce what in the country called Bhutan, we have a unique measure to measure the size of the countries, and that is the gross national happiness. So there's a very strong relationship between equity and happiness, and I'm glad that we'll be focusing on that. Neil, a wonderful colleague of mine, has already highlighted the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations up to 2020. There's one particular goal which explicitly addresses the issue of inequality. And this must have required courage on the part of the United Nations, because generally inequality is seen as a very sensitive subject in multilateral fora. However, due credit must be given to the UN for having introduced a target which says progressively achieve and sustain income group of the bottom 40% at a rate higher than the national average. So that is a tremendous step forward. The Millennium Development Goals which preceded had nothing on inequality. Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you some idea of the extent of inequality. Neil has already given you an indicator which goes back to the 60s of the famous 22 families. Let me give you some more, also some recent information based on the work that my very strong, wonderful team is doing on inequality. The first, let me highlight to you how the distribution of farm area is in Pakistan. According to the population and agricultural censuses, 1% of the farmers of Pakistan, believe it or not, 1%, 92,000 farmers, own 22% of the farm area of Pakistan. And the bottom 50%, who are about almost 5 million farmers, own only 12% of the farm area. I mean, this is inequality at an extreme. And this is seldom advertised because clearly land reform and other such issues have died in Pakistan. But we still continue to have a very strong feudal presence. These roughly 100,000 farmers, each has a farm which is about 500 acres in size. Let me just quote one more, and that is the wealth in the form of residential property. That is perhaps one of the most important indicators of wealth, the quality of your residential property. Here, according to the research we have done, the top 20% of the population owns almost 56% of the residential property, while the bottom 20% owns only 5%. The ratio is 11 to 1. This is the extent of inequality we see in this country. Let me give you some very important evidence on poverty based on some excellent work done by UNDP and the Oxford Institute for Human Development and Poverty. And I would like to play a little game with you. I'd like to ask you, where within our broader contours of a country, where do you think the incidence of poverty is the lowest? Do you want to make a guess? Anybody? Where do you think it's the lowest? Punjab? Anybody else? Lowest. Yes. Who said Kashmir? Brilliant. The lowest incidence of poverty is in Azad Jammu and Kashmir of only 24%. And we should be proud that while on the other side of the line of control there is chaos and havoc, in our part there is peace and progress. And I hope that we can highlight this internationally. Somebody mentioned Balochistan. Do you know that the incidence of poverty in Balochistan, multidimensional, is as high as 70%? 70%. And the part which has the highest incidence of poverty in our country is what you have referred to, federally administered tribal areas, FATA. 72% of the people of FATA are poor, based on this very good, high-quality research. Surely, we must begin to understand that one of the root causes of religious extremism and poverty, which has been at its peak, and, if you like, root causes of extremism and terrorism, is poverty, extreme poverty. And unless we can sort this problem out, we will continue to be confronted with this problem. Let me just take you through some other findings of our research. And maybe this may sound a bit provocative, but that's the whole idea in this wonderful festival. Our research spread from 1999-2000, the start of this century, up till now, comes to a very unexpected, perhaps even counterintuitive conclusion. What we are seeing is that inequality rose sharply up till 2008, from 2000 to 2007-8. Then it remained more or less constant for 3-4 years. And interestingly, after 2010-11, it has actually fallen in Pakistan. Unexpected, isn't it? There are two important correlations which begin to explain this curve like this. The first is higher growth leads to more inequality, unfortunately. What we have seen was high growth in 2000s, early 2000s. Then we saw low growth. Low growth, interestingly, 4.5% or so that we have seen in the last 5 years, has reduced inequality. So inclusiveness and sustainability are much more important than just having growth for the sake of growth. The trickle-down effect in the Musharraf era was even less than the growth we saw in the last 7-8 years in a period of democracy with less growth. Let me just conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by saying that one of the basic lessons that we are learning from our work is the extent of disparity in access to resources, opportunities, and so on. And if I may use a strong expression, we have an elite which is prone to state capture. And we would like to highlight what are the mechanisms and instruments that are present in our institutions, in our laws, in our practices, and in the power structure overall, which have led to structural problems of high inequality. So I assure you that over the next 4 to 6 months, we are working very hard to produce an objective and evidence-based inequality report for Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Anjab Saqib, who spent his life working on these issues, to say a little bit about what he thinks the effects of inequity are.
This is a literary, festival, and I am, remembering one of the famous quotes of a literary figure, Ishfaq Ahmed, who used to say that poverty is not only the lack of money. Poverty is lack of friendship, lack of connectivity, lack of relationship. If you allow me to say his actual words in Urdu, he used to say, "Ghurbat दौलत से महरूमी का नाम नहीं है, गुर्बत असल में अकेले रह जाने का नाम है। भरी दुनिया में कोई ऐसा शख्स नहीं जिसके कंधे पे आप सर रख सकें तो आप गरीब हैं." So I think in a very literary content he has described the essence of poverty. And this is the real issue, this exclusion. This political inclusion, social inclusion, financial inclusion. So all these are extremely important if we really want to address poverty. We have been working throughout Pakistan, Alhamdulillah, in the 4 provinces in southern Punjab, and most importantly, we have been working in FATA and in Gilgit-Baltistan and in Azad Jammu Kashmir as well. The whole focus of our solution to poverty is not giving them education or health facility or financial inclusion. We begin by inclusion. We first of all like to connect to the people. We would like to organize people. We would like to bring people at one platform, and we would like to inculcate a spirit of mutual reciprocity and solidarity. So I think, in isolation, if you are doing educational programs and other social development programs, or you are providing microfinance or other financial services, but as long as we are, increasing the gulf between haves and have-nots, we will never be able to address the issue of poverty. We will have to think on these issues, that how we can bring people together. We were poor, but still we were happy decades ago when our villages were vibrant, when there were no gaps, between poor and rich in a city. They were living in the same vicinity. But now we have different localities, different streets and different areas for the poor and for the rich. So I think there are multiple reasons for poverty. There are multiple areas how we can address this poverty, multiple solutions. But we must think that why this gap is increasing every day, why the rich are becoming richer and why the poor are poor, despite the growth, despite the increase in GDP, despite all this betterment in the technology and all other areas. We must see the spiritual or the moral dimension as well, that how can we help create a society where everybody is willing to support others, and this willingness will become, I think, the most important ingredient for ultimate solution. If you allow me to give the example of the organization Ukhuwat, which literally means solidarity or brotherhood. So we say that through this organization we have provided financial inclusion to 3 million people, families. But in fact, this is not what we say. We say that we have created a bond of solidarity, love, and compassion with these 3 million people. We don't go to them and say that look, this is money we have brought to you. We go and say that we are brothers and sisters. We are here to establish a bond of solidarity and love and brotherhood with you. All other things will follow. First of all, we would like to give them this feeling that we are not alone in society. We are part of a larger whole. And not only the state, but the entire civil society is thinking about us. And this will give them reassurance, and this will bring them in the mainstream. And this will, be perfect to help them realize their own potential. So this is my initial statement, that poverty is a multidimensional effect, multidimensional phenomena. And poverty is not only the lack of money. Poverty is social, it is spiritual, it is moral, it's political. And to address all these dimensions of poverty, we must create a society where there is not much gap between the haves and have-nots. For example, if 50% of haves in Pakistan embrace 50% of have-nots, just extend their arm and say that we are brothers. One family with one family. One person with one person. So in a larger context, this is also the spirit of mawakhat, which our Prime Minister is also raising, and he's saying that he will be trying to build the entire Pakistani society on the spirit and the teachings of Mawakhat in Medina. So Mawakhat also gives this message that if there are two sections of society, haves and have-nots, so just by creating this bond of solidarity between one person from haves and one person from have-nots, this is and also food for thought, that would it be a practical or pragmatic way to eliminate poverty.
Thank you very much. Eram, you've been deeply involved internationally and nationally in Pakistan on issues. She led was a key part of a panel yesterday on water issues. And there's a big interface between environmental issues and poverty, but many others, so over to you.
Thanks so much. Okay, what I want to put on the table is differential access, and I'm going to focus very carefully and very precisely on water. It really does matter, and let's see if this gives us something to think about. We have a system, a canal irrigation system that runs throughout this country. The British essentially created this system starting in the 1800s, and there is something called Varabandi. So what it is it's a time allocation of water turn. So for your plot of land, supposing you get, it's like turn by turn by turn, right, down a canal system. The idea when they designed the system is that they wanted it to be very equitable. And that's a term that will help us think about something. They wanted it to be equitable because the idea was that therefore everyone would get water that you would need to grow a certain amount, that would sort of help you cultivate your size of plot. And that would be somehow promoting where everybody would have enough, and enough food security, etc., would be produced by this Varabandi. What's fascinating is that pretty much from the start of this system, which is really like the core, of how the country sort of, say 20-25% of our GDP is still linked to an agricultural income, right? So it really is the core of the economic base. However you think about it, we have to start thinking about the rural areas. So essentially, it was always supposed to be equitable. But pretty much from day one, what happens with this system is that it is deeply inequitable. What ends up happening is that the more influential, who have more access, again, I mean, you mentioned, sort of state capture, who have more access to power, utilize a lot more than their particular turn of water. So if they're supposed to get, water for 6 hours, I mean, maybe they'll take the next one down's line, turn, the next one down, right? So they are utilizing much more than their actual share. Essentially, the system has never worked largely as intended. So a system even designed to be equitable, where they're really thinking about this in the 1830s, that says, we will uplift everyone and everyone will have some kind of food security, has not functioned like that. So this differential access, inequitable access to a crucial natural resource such as water is is elemental in a semi-arid environment. That really does matter. There is plenty of land, but irrigated land is what is of value. All of the fights are about water. All of the power is linked to whether or not you can get more water than your turn. So this background, and now I'm going to put a small problem. This idea that somehow we can keep everyone at an equal level and then everyone will be okay is, I think, deeply problematic also, because then it never allows anyone perhaps to figure out, maybe I can use water more efficiently, maybe I can use crops that I can export, etc. So this idea of, and this is a vision sort of conflict, right? What sort of society do we want to create? Is it where everyone has enough to eat plus a little surplus and is largely at a similar level, or do we really want to figure out, is there a way to uplift and a few people get more ahead, etc. Right now, it's sort of through cheating almost, right? And it's using your levers of power and it's utilizing much more than your equitable share, so-called. So even if you design a system as equitable, because of family relations, power relations, marriage relations, biradri, this has always worked in this part of the world, and the British, by the way, knew this, and they basically pretty much gave up on this idea that we were ever going to be able to run this equitably. It has never run equitably. So this is a major challenge in a sort of hydrologically dry environment. So I want to put this idea of equity and the lack of it in a natural resource, but it's really a fundamental construct of this country. And so for me, I want us to start really thinking very hard about this access to natural resources, whether it's water. In my case, that's what I study. I sort of obsess about it, but I think it really does matter. But of course, there are many, many, many other things. If I could, so I just finished teaching environmental law, and one of the things that all of you here in Lahore sitting are aware of is air quality, right? So this idea of we all breathe the same air, right? So how do you even, sort of have pockets of air where it's clean air or not? So we have to start thinking of natural resources and what is it that we all share equally, and what is it that we can somehow utilize our levers of power and utilize more than our due turn or our due share. So I just wanted to sort of help problematize some of this history that structures this country.
Is in the hot seat right now as he's the finance minister of KPK, and he's taken on that job coming from things where he could have been doing something else, I think, which is to be very much respected. And he has to deal with actually practical policies to deal with these issues. So I'm going to give the floor to him.
The choices are hard. They're incredibly hard. It's easy to talk about equality. I prefer other words, but let me illustrate. Make the choice for yourself. Was the more equal China of the late 70s a better place where everyone was equally poor? Or is the China of today, or even 10 years ago? I lived in China between 2003 and 2005. And the emerging levels of inequality were clear. And yes, they bring problems and lots of deep problems, but also the fact that they were pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, also clear. So I guess the challenge is, as in many things, that you've got to find a balance, right? Very clearly, and I think the word, Iram, you were looking for when you said everyone being equal is communism, and yes, there's people who can still ascribe to that as a philosophy or as an endpoint. But very clearly, there is the counter view of saying, if I'm going to create wealth, it's going to find its way disproportionately. And if I have a choice of trying to stifle wealth creation and spread it across, or try to go for the goal of try to give everyone a minimum living standard, what do I do and how do I prevent the balance going too far one way or the other? I think that's the real practical challenge. We face that every day. On top of that, we face that with constraints of capacity on the resources that we have. And that takes me to the second point. We can sit and talk about it until the cows come home, but it's really about action. I think we have some incredibly talented people in this country, as we do in many other countries. I think we have some incredibly smart people, incredibly noble people. But the ones that I respect the most are the ones that actually roll their sleeves up and do something about it. I've met Dr. Amjad Saqib 5 or 6 years ago, and what I respect, and I'm not saying this to your face, is not necessarily the smartness, but the humility and the drive for action. Someone may be making a difference to 100 people, someone to 1,000 people, someone to 100,000 people, but that's what's going to make the difference. And practically the issues that we see, if they were issues of policy or smarter policy, we would have gone way further ahead than we have. If you look at the different components of inequity, whether that's education, right? Again, you have this issue of trying to give everyone a uniform standard of education, or if you actually want everyone to learn in their best learning environment. I've worked in education for about a decade. That system needs to be much more bespoke, and if it needs to be bespoke, it actually needs to cater to people's mother tongue, it needs to cater to people's background, and therefore, by definition, if you want people learning the most, they need to learn in slightly different environments, right? The same if you're talking about health. And so, whether when I was working as a consultant at McKinsey or now working in government, what frustrates me the most is people who will talk of the policy required to create change but not be willing to take half a step, let that be an imperfect step, towards actually translating some of that into action. And so I think that's where the debate or the spotlight, I think the word debate in itself is part of the problem. That's where the spotlight needs to be. And so I think the third thing, as Dr. Hafiz Pasha said, I think these sessions, if they have to have value, have to be about being a little bit provocative, is about redefining equity or our goals on this front a little bit, right? There is definitely the social dimension. I think I'm just going to take a couple of lenses at this. One is to throw 2 or 3 words, which I think are better barometers of what we're trying to achieve. One is, and I'm going to steal these words from what everyone has said, one is about greater meritocracy, because that creates opportunity. And I think part of the dissatisfaction of inequality in societies has to be driven about dissatisfaction about opportunity or the sense of injustice that people feel. And hence, the need for meritocracy in society is important, because if I don't have a chance, then I've got no sense to be optimistic or happy at all. And hence, the second one is opportunity. Whatever we can do, and what the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government is trying to go big on, I think the entire national government is this element of, you know, giving people a chance by giving them an opportunity, giving them a little bit of capital, the sort of interest-free microfinance that Amjad Saqib Saab and other organizations are working on, because we've got to give people the opportunity to live ahead, and that's one question that is constantly ticking in our mind. I think a third thing, and one we certainly lack as a nation, I'll put my hand up and say the first thing. This is where the Prime Minister tends to inspire me sometimes. The third word is empathy. If the haves don't have empathy for the have-nots, you know, it's interesting that to create this culture of, and it may even be symbolic, of having shelter homes for the homeless. It actually needs in our society the Prime Minister to raise his voice when there's plenty of property, plenty of opportunity to do this. So it makes me think in a way there's so many of us that even perhaps may be working on reducing inequity, that may be on some dimensions morally dead, or certainly can do better on this dimension of empathy. But lastly, there's the other elements of inequality. Remember that we're a federation. I'm very grateful that Dr. Hafiz Pasha mentioned FATA. I can certainly tell you that in terms of, look, if you cut society different ways, if you cut it by ethnicity, if you cut it by sex, if you cut it by the urban-rural divide, I think this is where people in one part of the country or in one of these divides look at another part and say, this is unfair, this is unequal. To me, the biggest example, and again I'm going to, I've lived, not really lived, but I've traveled to Lahore every week between 2011 and 2017 working on education reform in my previous career. But it did strike me in the bad old days of greater militancy that when this country was suffering from, that whenever that militancy hit close to home, mainstream Pakistan, let's say Lahore, Karachi, Islamabad, our reaction and our concern was very different than when it hit the 5 million people of FATA. And actually, when you think of it, those 5 million people we've ignored for about 70 years, ignored of being equal citizens. And that's not the only pocket in the country. So does it really surprise us, right, that pockets of society within places like FATA and Balochistan raise their hands and say, there's something seriously wrong or inequitable in the way that we're being dealt? And I also question whether that's the last thing that I'll say, whether that's just economic opportunity or investing economic resources. It certainly is. It's a massive part of the problem. Or whether it's also political opportunity in terms of giving people the sense that they've got equal rights and are equal citizens. And that, I think, in terms of reducing inequality and increasing happiness, is probably, in my opinion, not just the biggest challenge for the government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but also for the entire country, to include these elements that have been excluded from the mainstream of the country.